when is it a good time for a man to use TRT, and when shouldn't you use TRT? I mean, that's probably a very broad question, but I know men are interested in this topic. And then I suppose it would depend somewhat on your levels. So could you talk about testosterone levels, and were your levels low when you started using? And depending on your testosterone levels, should you be using TRT or not?
Yeah, and this is one of the most important questions. So when I started this, there was maybe one book written on this. I had to find people in the US to guide me on it because it was a very niche subject. Now it's a bit of a buzzword, which I think is a double edged sword. I think it's great that more people are becoming aware of it, but I think it's also being used more recklessly and haphazardly. And it's a big card to play. It's the bazooka in the back pocket if it's needed, and it should be played when it's needed, but it shouldn't be played prematurely because it is a very invasive thing to do to the body. So I had very low testosterone levels at the time, and looking back on my early 20s, I probably didn't have good testosterone levels to begin with. And that probably brings me to my first point on this is that 10, 20, 30 years ago, low testosterone was the male version of menopause. It was the thing that happened when you got old enough, your levels declined. We call it andropause. And you would need hormone replacement therapy to restore the levels back to what you had when you were a healthy 20, 30-year-old. These days, the problem is that the younger generation are growing up with the testosterone levels of a 90-year-old. And it's pretty damn obvious if you look out at the average 19, 20-year-old these days. I went to my 10-year high school reunion and I graduated in 2009. And there's a group photo of the 100 to 150 kids in the year. And there was 2019, 2009, 1999, 1989. So all the kids in these photos were 16 or 17 years old. And the guys in 1989 looked like they could eat the guys from 2019 for breakfast. It was a completely different human. They looked about 5 years older and about 50 times more masculine. And I think, and there's no hard knowledge on this, it's all theories from people like myself, but we believe it's a combination of the pollutions, plastics, and pesticides that we're growing up with. And I think my generation was on the front end of that, as well as the new health conditions that didn't used to be an issue. Obesity is a huge problem. If you're obese during development and not going outside and doing proper physical activity, it's going to stunt the development of your hormone system for both men and women. And I think this is becoming a problem as well. So we've now got this myth where, well, if you're in your early 20s or your late 20s or your early 30s and you go to the gym and you eat well and you look after yourself, you'll have healthy testosterone levels. And this just isn't true. So a lot of younger men are going to the doctor or going to a counselor or a psychologist with a biological problem that's underpinning their psychological symptoms of anxiety and depression. So if someone is to go on TRT, it's important to look at both the symptoms and the levels because the problem is the symptoms are very ambiguous. You can have a low libido and difficulty putting on muscle and excess body fat and depression and anxiety for a huge amount of reasons. Um, and that's why it's important that we look at the levels as well. But one of the issues that we're having now is that the reference range that we look at on the blood work is a calculation of the last 100 men who've had their testosterone levels checked with the mean and the standard deviation either side. It's not a reference range of health. And this reference range has declined drastically over the last 20 years. So 10 years ago, when I first got my testosterone level checked, the reference range for total testosterone was 10 to 35. Now it's 6 to 24. So if you were previously at the lower end of the range or the lower quartile, you're now in the middle. So if you go to a GP and he's not clued into this and he's just looking at the labs and he's going, well, your testosterone level is normal, there's nothing wrong with this. You can be hypergonadal, in the middle of the reference range these days. And unless you see a specialist, you wouldn't know. So I also think that the second problem with that is that I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I'm pretty far down the rabbit hole. Is I also think that there is an agenda to suppress testosterone and masculinity because it is the only molecule that's ever been studied in an interventional setting that has made people less compliant with conditioning. It makes less people likely to follow rules. And if you remove people's capacity for operant conditioning, then they're going to be easier to control. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the main medications used for psychiatric disorders and low grade mood issues are things that increase operant conditioning, which are things like SSRIs and antidepressants. So it's a big card to play, but if men leave low testosterone untreated and it can't be resolved with diet and lifestyle, which should always be the first mechanism and interaction that we use, it's something that can rapidly accelerate, physical and psychological disease states. And I think that it's something that a lot of guys are struggling with and don't realize. And that's why I'm such a big advocate of, spreading this message that men should get their testosterone levels looked at.